All right, and I think I just got the notification that we are recording. All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Tracy. I'm really excited that I was invited here to speak with you all about this topic, and I'm really hoping that you all can walk away with at least one thing that you learned or one, hopefully practical skill that you can use with the families that you work with. So our official learning objectives for today are, for the first half of this, we're going to be kind of going into a little bit of background to ensure that we all have a shared understanding of some important concepts. So this includes things like stress, complex trauma, co-regulation, resilience that we'll be speaking about. We're also going to identify ways in which complex trauma can manifest in children. And then finally, my hope for you is that you learn at least 3 practical strategies that you can walk away with to promote emotion regulation in yourself, in the youth you work with, and in the adults you work with or the parents. All right, so to get us started, we're first going to talk about stress. Because before defining trauma, I thought it was important that we have an understanding of what stress is so we can really understand the difference. So stress is the natural human response to any type of tension or challenge in situation. So this can be one short-term single event, like an argument or getting a bad grade on a test, or a reoccurring condition, like managing a really difficult job at school. And this is a completely natural reaction. It affects both of our mind and our body. And we know that when there is too much stress, it can be typically temporarily harmful to our both physical and mental health. However, stress is not always harmful. It's not always a bad thing. Stress is actually really necessary to help motivate us to complete tasks and face challenges. So some examples of some life events that are typically considered not traumatic but stressful for a young person include things like moving homes or schools, divorce, and death of a chronically ill or elderly loved one. So again, these events are generally non-traumatic but still may be very stressful and may temporarily disrupt someone's functioning. All right, so then what is trauma? So I use SAMHSA's definition using the 3 E's to help us define and really understand what is this general term of trauma that I think is thrown around a lot. So the first piece of this is the event. So a traumatic experience is an event that was frightening, dangerous, or violent, and that poses a threat to a person's life or bodily integrity. And this does not have to be something that an individual directly experienced. It could be something that was witnessed or learned about. And this is especially important in like young children whose sense of safety really depends on the perceived safety of their caregiver. The second component to this definition is that this event has to be experienced by the individual as emotionally or physically harmful. So this is really important to know because we all experience things very differently. If 2 people get in a car accident, one person may experience it as extremely scary and may walk away not wanting to go in a car for a long time. The other person may not experience it that way. Maybe they've been in a car accident before, they think it's fine, they may be fine just hopping back in a car driving away. So it really depends on the person. And similarly, where we'll see a lot of variance is that the effects of the trauma. So there must be adverse, both long and term effects on the person's functioning. And this can include a whole wide variety of different factors, which we're going to discuss in more depth in a minute. And some examples of situations that are often traumatic or often result in a traumatic response, but again, we cannot say always because everyone responds differently, include abuse or neglect, family or community violence, the sudden or violent death of a loved one, serious accidents, life-threatening illnesses, and things like migration, terrorism, and war. And it's important to note that unlike stress, trauma is almost always harmful to the individual. All right, so now that we define trauma or trauma response, we're going to discuss the formal diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder of PTSD. And this is a diagnosis that mental health professionals give. It is defined in this book, the DSM, which stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which really lists out all the diagnoses and the criteria needed for meeting each so that we have the shared standard of how we are diagnosing people. So according to the DSM, in order to meet criteria for PTSD, One first has to be exposed to an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And similar to the definition we just discussed on the previous slide, this does not have to be directly experienced. It can be witnessed or learning about something happening to a loved one. The next component that must be met is symptoms in the following 4 domains. So again, I just want to emphasize that just because someone has experienced a traumatic event does not mean that they are going to necessarily have a traumatic response or meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So in order to meet criteria for PTSD, one has to display intrusive symptoms. So these are these repeatedly unwanted experiences or thoughts that pop into people's heads. So this can include things like flashbacks, but also can include nightmares. In children, we sometimes will see reenactment through play with themes of trauma. The second category of symptoms includes avoidance symptoms. So this is really the avoidance of any type of cues related to the trauma. So this can be internal cues, so avoiding thinking about it, avoiding memories, or avoidance of external reminders, like avoiding certain places that remind you of what happened or certain people. The third category of symptoms is arousal and reactivity. So with heightened arousal, we will see someone that is kind of always on alert, like this hypervigilance, where they're always looking out for danger. We sometimes will see an exaggerated startle response. And then with reactivity, we can see just like very large explosive reactions, such as like an angry outburst or reckless behavior. And also in this category falls things like trouble with concentration and with sleep. And the fourth category are negative alterations in mood and cognitions. So within this category, this includes things like feelings of fear, horror, anger, and guilt, a loss of interest in joyful activities, negative self-beliefs about the world or the self, things like no one could ever be trusted or I'm a bad person, and feelings of detachment. All right, now we're going to get to complex trauma, which is kind of the focus of this presentation. And I wanted to note that complex trauma is actually not in the DSM, so it's not recognized by the DSM as a formal diagnosis. However, it is very much recognized by the mental health community as being a very real and concerning concept. There's just not a formal diagnosis for it in the DSM at this time, unfortunately. But essentially, complex trauma is like PTSD plus. It really extends beyond that of PTSD. So complex trauma involves the experiencing of multiple or prolonged traumatic events that usually occur within the caregiving system. So this is typically something like abuse or neglect that begins in very early childhood and is chronic in nature. And these symptoms and the outcomes really extend beyond PTSD. And we'll discuss what exactly those look like in just a moment. And unfortunately, what we see is that a lot of times these initial early childhood traumatic experiences can cause emotion dysregulation and things like difficulty recognizing danger. And unfortunately, that just then leads that individual to be more prone to being exposed to subsequent trauma exposure. So it's like this negative cycle. All right, so there are 7 domains of impact of complex trauma that symptoms are divided in. So we're going to go through each of those so we have a good understanding. So the first is attachment. That refers to a child's ability to form a secure and trusting relationship with others. This is typically based on the child's relationship with their primary caregiver, and it can affect things like trust, boundaries, whether someone is clingy or withdrawn, etc. The next domain is biology. So when a child grows up under constant or extreme stress, their brain, immune system, and stress response don't develop normally. So this can affect a lot of different things like eating, sleep, unexplained pain or medical conditions, and more. Affect regulation is the next area. So this is really the ability to understand, express, and modulate our emotional experiences. So this can be very challenging and very disruptive in a lot of ways for children and individuals who've experienced complex trauma, oftentimes resulting in intense emotional outbursts and then difficulty calming down after being upset. Dissociation is when the mind disconnects from feelings, the body, or surrounding as a coping mechanism. And long-term, this can result in compartmentalization of painful memories, feelings of detachment from the self and others, a lack of awareness, and even some sort of amnesia and impaired memory. Behavioral control. So this refers to how we control our actual physical behaviors. So with complex trauma, we can see both ends of the spectrum here. We can see over-controlled behavior, so things like perfectionism and an inflexible resistance to change. And then we can see under-controlled, so things like impulsivity, aggression, and self-destructive behaviors. Cognition refers to a number of different thinking skills that can be affected by complex trauma. And this kind of ties back to the biology domain and just the brain development being affected by trauma. So things like attention, learning, and problem solving, and a lot more can be affected by complex trauma. And finally, self-concept. So this is how a person views themselves. And unfortunately, people that have experienced complex trauma oftentimes have a poor self-esteem and carry a lot of shame and guilt with them. All right. So I'm going to go into a little more detail and just provide a few more examples of behaviors and symptoms that we may see in the youth that we work with, specifically with our justice-involved youth. So in the domain of attachment, we may see a sense of distrust and suspiciousness, especially towards adults. We may see someone that really struggles to understand and take perspectives of others and has trouble understanding others' emotional states. And sometimes we may see trouble with boundaries, whether it's too loose or too rigid. In the biology domain, some symptoms or behaviors we may see include hypervigilance. So I mentioned that earlier, that's like being on, constant alert for danger. Trouble sitting still. So it could look like something like ADHD when it's really coming from complex trauma. Unexplained pains and trouble sleeping, which is definitely something we see a lot. In the domain of dissociation, you might see a kid that just looks really disinterested or completely zoned out. And of course, that may, as the adults that are working with them may be frustrating, but it's really important to try to consider from this trauma lens that this may be that they are dissociating, not that they just do not care. In addition, individuals may have delayed or incomplete responses when you ask them information, and even gaps in memory. In the area of affect regulation, we will see extreme mood swings. So this is going from 0 to 100, just like that. Anger outbursts, crying or laughing at inappropriate times, possibly, and even numbing, which is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum.
I park here all the time and I work here.
Let's see. And we'll see numbing. So that is really when someone is expressing no emotions at all, really the opposite end of the spectrum, and they appear really, really cold and unbothered. And finally, behavioral control. So this can include things like risk taking, so things like drug use, driving fast, unsafe sex. It can include oppositionality, so especially again towards adults and authority figures, really difficulty following rules, respecting, and then reacting and responding defensively and even aggressively, especially in response to any type of perceived blame or threat. In the domain of cognition, some specific behaviors or symptoms we might see include someone really struggling to understand or remember their information. Again, it may seem like they're not really paying attention, where in fact, just cognitively, they're unable to hold and understand the information. You may see a kid or family member that's contradicting themselves or second guessing themselves, has difficulty focusing, and holds really negative core beliefs. And in self-concept, we may see someone with a low self-esteem, but that may be masked by a sense of false confidence or bravado. So this like persona of being like a tough guy. We also sometimes will see individuals that over-identify with this identity of being a delinquent. And so this leads them to avoid having possible positive experiences because they have this belief that they are, no matter what, going to be delinquent and they don't deserve success. All right, so we are going to speak about self-regulation because dysregulation is really the key that cuts across all 7 of these domains. So self-regulation is the management of thoughts and feelings so that we can behave in ways that helps reach our goals, both in the present moment and in the future. And self-regulation includes a whole bunch of skills, things like impulse control, managing stress, managing anger, problem solving, and decision making. Self-regulation is really foundational for our overall well-being across a number of domains. So this includes our emotional well-being, our physical health, even things like academic achievement and socioeconomic success. Self-regulation is not something we're born with and not even something that just develops in childhood. It develops slowly over time through and even beyond young adulthood. And self-regulation can be affected by a number of factors, both internal and external. So internal factors like genetics and temperament can very much affect how someone self-regulates, but also these external factors like home and school environment and caregiver support. Oh, sorry. All right. And finally, the other thing we know is that the development of self-regulation really relies on and develops through these repeated interactions with adults or caregivers who model, teach, and encourage self-regulation skills. And this concept is called co-regulation, which we're going to be speaking a lot more about in just a minute. So complex trauma can disrupt the development of self-regulation in various ways, thus resulting in the dysregulation we just spoke about. So one way that it can be disrupted is through the actual brain development. We know that repeated exposure to traumatic experiences can lead to the underdevelopment or change in development of essential brain structures that are really needed for regulating our emotions and our behaviors. We also know that repeated exposure to trauma can lead to chronic activation of the stress response system. So this is like you're constantly being prepared for fight or flight, which makes it extremely difficult to effectively self-regulate if you are kind of never at this baseline of calm. And last, children who experience complex trauma unfortunately oftentimes grow up with caregivers who are unpredictable, unavailable, or even frightening. And as a result, these youth miss really critical opportunities for co-regulation. So to learn self-regulation by observing an adult that is consistent and caring. Instead, they may witness their caregiver handling stress through maladaptive stress strategies, such as drug or alcohol use or aggression. And unfortunately, this pattern is common as many caregivers have also experienced complex trauma themselves and may struggle with their own self-regulation. All right, we are going to quickly pause. We just talked a lot about complex trauma and all of the very significant and negative effects that it can have on individuals. However, there is hope. Humans and children are resilient and are capable of coping with complex trauma. So what is resilience? It is the process of successfully adapting and coping with life experiences, such as trauma. Resilience is associated with a number of positive outcomes, including improved mental health and greater life satisfaction. Pre-existing factors do affect one's resilience. So these can include things like self-esteem, parent-child relationship, home and school environment. And this is really where our role comes in, there are ways that we can enhance resilience even after a traumatic event happens. So resilience is not just determined at one point in life and it ends there. There are constantly opportunities for people to build and enhance their resilience. So ways in which this can be done is through positive and supportive relationships with adults, feeling safe at home and in one's community, having an increased access to resources, and possessing a variety of adaptive and flexible coping skills. All right, so finally got to co-regulation. I mentioned this concept before. So to give a formal definition, co-regulation is a supportive process between an adult and a youth that fosters self-regulation development in the youth. And while I mentioned earlier that self-regulation develops over time from infancy to early adult, there are 2 distinct periods when self-regulation abilities can have the chance to increase dramatically. And this is due to corresponding changes in the brain. So the first of these is during early childhood, and this would be typically when a child is learning how to self-regulate from their caregivers, possibly teachers or other adults. The second period is actually adolescence, which is the age group of most of the youth that we work with. So this is really an opportunity for us to make small but meaningful changes and just small day-to-day interactions to really promote self-regulation and really possibly change, how this person deals with stress and anger and sadness for the rest of their life. So there's really a lot of opportunity here. And there are three primary elements of co-regulation, three kind of things that we can do to really promote co-regulation. The first of those is providing warm and responsive relationships. The second is coaching and modeling skills. And the third is creating supportive environments. So each of these could easily have its own talk for like an hour. So we're not going to be speaking as much about creating supportive environments today. However, of course, if that's something that you're interested in learning about, please put that in your evaluation, and that could be the subject of a future topic. All right, so this picture of the co-regulation framework really highlights the importance of adult self-regulation, which is symbolized by this arrow that's wrapping around the circle. And what this is saying is basically, in order for successful co-regulation to take place, the adult must be able to manage their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. In a way, this is like securing your own oxygen mask on an airplane before assisting others. So how do we enhance our own self-regulation? We can practice skills. So these skills that I'm going to be teaching today can be used by anyone. In fact, I was doing some breathing exercises right before this. So this is not just to be used with youth and families, but very much can be used for yourself. We can also notice and identify our feelings, assumptions, beliefs, biases that we have about the youth and families we work with, and really notice and pay attention to our reactions during stressful times. And I want to acknowledge that self-regulation can be really difficult, especially in our roles. Working in courts, working with really challenging youth and families, our jobs can be really, really stressful and often can lead to dysregulation at times. And that is okay. The expectation is not that we are 100% regulated and perfect at all times. However, just by increasing our awareness to these things, we can better recognize when we need to attend to our own regulation before we're trying to help anyone else. So the first component of this is providing warm and responsive relationships. So I'm going to go through this slide, but I invite the audience, please, as we're going through this, if things pop into your head about how this might be difficult, please, I invite you to share. Because a lot of things on this slide may seem kind of, they're not rocket science. They are very likely things that you've heard before, not surprising. However, given our different roles and the environment we're in, some of these things can be quite difficult. So some of these guides for providing warm and responsive relationships include paying attention to your tone, volume, and body language. This is especially important for individuals who've experienced trauma, as certain volumes or body languages can be very triggering or threatening. Really taking time to build trust. Again, this could be hard because we have a job to do and we have multiple clients and families we're working with. But as much as we can, taking even just a little bit of time to build a little trust, and possibly doing that by involving the youth and families in decisions that affect them and explaining what you are doing and why. I've heard from a lot of kids that they have really no idea what's going on in court, but they're too embarrassed or nervous to ask about what's going on. So that can really make a huge difference if you're able to just explain that in a developmentally appropriate way so that the individual knows what's going on and what's going to be affecting their own life. Of course, active listening is really important. So putting down your phone and not checking emails when you're meeting with a family or a child, trying not to interrupt them and just giving them your focus. It also can really help to build the relationship and build trust by encouraging discussion, having open-ended questions. And validation is also something that really opens up conversation and discussion, and we're going to speak about that next. All right. So validation is communicating to a person that their thoughts, feelings, and/or behaviors make sense. This does not mean that you like or agree with what the other person is saying, feeling, or doing. Validation simply acknowledges that kernel of truth in the person's perspective by validating only the parts that are reasonable and logical in a situation, rather than just blindly agreeing with the individual's entire statement. In contrast, invalidation communicates to a person that their feelings, thoughts, or actions make no sense, that they are possibly manipulative or stupid or having an overreaction or are not worthy of your time. So validation is so important because by simply validating someone, we can improve a relationship, decrease emotional intensity, and de-escalate conflict. And in turn, when emotional intensity is decreased, an individual is typically able to communicate their emotions and express their emotions more accurately. And then it becomes even easier for us to validate, resulting in this positive cycle. However, I want to acknowledge this is definitely easier said than done. Oftentimes, our natural reaction is not to validate. Oftentimes, we want to problem solve or reassure or calm the person down. So if you think of when a little kid trips and falls and starts crying, if you think of a typical response, a lot of times the parent rushes in saying, "You're okay, you're okay." Of course, the intention there is positive to calm and reassure the child. However, it's not validating, right? You're not acknowledging that they may be hurt, that they're crying, right? So a validating response instead would be like, "It looks like that was painful. Are you okay?" And a lot of times that's just not our natural reaction. So this is definitely something that requires some practice. It's also important to note that validation may not always be possible, especially if we ourselves are dysregulated. It also may not be appropriate depending on the situation, whatever is going on, and especially because we never want to validate the invalid. So to help us better understand what validation is, we're going to speak about what validation is not. So validation, as I mentioned before, is not agreement. It is not just simply agreeing with the person. So an example here of something someone may say is, "My probation officer hates me." Someone may respond, "Yeah, POs can be tough," just seeming that that's, agreeing with them in an okay response. But really that's cutting the conversation short, not acknowledging what they said, and not inviting them to share more. So a validating response instead that we could say is, "It sounds like you feel disliked or misunderstood by your PO." That can have a really heavy feeling. Next, it's not problem solving. Again, a lot of times we want to jump into problem solving and be helpful, resolve the situation, but that is not what validation is. So another example here is, "I'm so stressed about court tomorrow, I can't even think straight." Someone may respond, "It'll be fine, just get some sleep," right? Maybe they're just trying to reassure the person, they're trying to suggest what they should do, go to sleep. Again, I totally can understand why that would be a natural response, and that's not necessarily validating. So something else that you could respond would be, "It makes sense that you feel stressed. Court can be really overwhelming." And finally, validation is not over reassurance or indiscriminate praise. I think sometimes people feel that when they validate, they're going to accidentally encourage a bad behavior or just kind of give this like false sense of reassurance, and that's not what it is about. So as an example, if a parent were to say, "I feel like I've completely failed as a parent," one may respond, "No, you haven't, you're a great parent," right? Just giving them this like false sense of hope, even if it's not true, or, "Well, at least you're better than a lot of parents I've seen." And neither of these are really acknowledging that parent's emotions. So something else in that situation we could say is, "I hear how you've been trying. Feeling like a failure often comes with caring deeply and wanting better for your child." And I do want to jump back really quick to the problem solving, is that this does not mean that we can't problem solve or that we can't agree or any of these things. It just means before all of that, we really want to validate first before jumping into problem solving, first validating and then saying, "Is there anything I can do that I can help you with right now? Or do you want to talk through what's worrying you the most?" All right, a little bit more about how we can validate. So we can validate feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. A really kind of easy and safe thing to validate if we're worried about accidentally invalidating a negative behavior is to simply reflect their feelings and validate their feelings without judgment. So simply kind of finding that underlying valid emotion and putting words to it, saying something that, "I understand that you're upset," or, "I hear that you're having a difficult time." especially when you don't understand or agree where they're coming from. Simply observing and describing the facts, and also acknowledging that it makes sense given their past experiences and the current situation that they would feel this way. So simply saying, you're angry about the judge's decision, or I understand why you'd think that and feel that way based on your past experiences. We can even validate and not agree. So we could say something like, I can see your point of view and I don't agree with you. An important thing here is to say and instead of but. A lot of times we naturally say but, and that really kind of disregards the first part of the sentence. Instead, when we use and, we are acknowledging that both of these things can hold true at the same time. That I'm acknowledging your point of view and I can see it, and I don't agree with it, but both can exist at the same time. And finally, of course, we do not want to validate the invalid, right? We do not want to validate a maladaptive behavior or, encourage something that's not true, like a maladaptive cognition. So something that's really important is we can validate the emotion without validating the maladaptive behavior. An example here, again, with using the and, is I understand that you're upset by the judge's decision, and storming out of the courtroom isn't going to help the situation. So we're not condoning that this kid apparently stormed out, and we're still validating, acknowledging that they're upset. All right, now we are going to switch gears and talk about coaching and modeling, and we're going to get into some of these specific skills. So before we dive into the specific skills, I want to talk a little bit about how exactly we can coach and model. So one, practice is really, really important. Like I said, these skills can be used by anyone. And if we don't really know how to do the skills, or if we're like, this breathing's kind of stupid, or we're showing our own resistance, the kid or family's not going to buy it. They're not going to want to join in. So really being confident in your coping strategies and being able to model those with comfort and openness, and inviting the youth and family to join in. And it's really important, expect some resistance. They may not just be like, yes, I'm so happy to join in and breathe with you right away, right? And it's really important to still model that, because that's still giving that individual the opportunity to observe an adult using an adaptive coping skill. So it may not seem like they're paying attention or they're not doing it with you, and it still can be a really valuable learning experience. Other things we can do include narrate in the moment coping strategies that youth can use. Engaging the caregivers when possible. It could be an opportunity for you to teach not only the youth, but the parent as well. And that can be another opportunity for modeling and co-regulation if this parent is able to, learn about this coping skill and then bring it back home. We really want to praise all efforts to use coping strategies, even if it's, only for a few seconds, even if they say it doesn't work. Just the fact that they are willing to try an adaptive coping strategy rather than relying on a maladaptive behavior is something that we want to encourage and praise. Another thing that is really, really important is that we integrate these strategies into everyday interactions. A lot of time we think coping strategies are just for when we're really stressed or just when we're in a crisis. But really, it's super important to practice when we're not. We want to practice when we're at our baseline. Because when we're in a crisis, our brain is not working in the same way and we're not able to learn things as well. So if we practice these skills when we're in a calm space, it will be so much easier to access that skill and then do the skill, whatever it is, when we are in a crisis. And finally, of course, we want to respect boundaries and emotional safety of the youth and families we work with. So we would never want to force a youth or family to engage in a strategy, force them to do some kind of coping skill with you. Respect their decision if they say no, we can't force them. And allow a cool off or for them to opt out or step away if that's possible. All right, so a number of the skills I'm going to be speaking about today are from a group intervention called SPARKS. And SPARKS stands for Structured Psychotherapy for Adolescents Responding to Chronic Stress. And this is a present-oriented, strengths-based group that tries to help youth who've experienced trauma find the spark of light within themselves to build on their strengths and resilience, and to make better choices in their lives through mindful action. And I'm mentioning this because we do Sparks here at the JTDC. Our goal is to do at least one full round of the curriculum of Sparks with every pod. And it is also done at many CPS schools as well as a number of IDJJ youth centers. So it's very likely that the kids you work with may actually already know these skills. And also just knowing that it's not just your responsibility to completely teach these skills from the ground up. A lot of times kids will come in with some kind of background knowledge and we have the opportunity just to reinforce. Alrighty, so our first skill we're going to talk about is called SOS. This is a skill from Sparks. It is used in every session at the beginning and at the end, and it stands for slow down, orient, and self-check. And really this is prompting the youth to notice and identify how they're feeling. And this is helpful because simply by acknowledging how we're feeling, we have more control over our actions. It's the very first step towards coping more effectively. It's also really helpful because it can make us more aware of other stress levels. So maybe, you share your SOS level and then the youth shares theirs, and you guys have a better understanding of kind of where you're both at. This can also be helpful to learn and experience a wide range of intensity, so that people can understand they're not always at one extreme or the other, but there's a lot of things that fall, a lot of emotions that fall really in that middle range. All right, so before I walk us through it, just to explain a little further, so this first step of slow down is really going to help us to focus beforehand rather than just jumping in and saying, I feel this, to really kind of slow our body down, slow our mind down, and kind of focus and really think about how we're feeling. We're then going to orient, so kind of bring ourselves back to the present moment and remind ourselves of where we are and who we are with. And then we will do the self-check. All right, so we are going to practice the SOS right now. So I invite you wherever you are to just engage in this by yourself, or if you're with other people, you can share your self-check numbers if you feel comfortable. But we're going to start by slowing down. So I invite you to pause and take a seat back in your chair. And if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. Take a minute to notice how your body is feeling. Are you holding any tension in certain parts of your body? As you take a deep breath in through your nose, feel the air fill your chest and slowly exhale through your mouth like you're breathing through a straw. Again, take a deep breath in through your nose and exhale through your mouth. Acknowledge any thoughts or feelings that are popping into your head without judgment and trying not to hold on to any specific one. All right, and slowly bring your mind and your body back to the present moment. You can help orient yourself by planting your feet firmly on the floor, kind of feeling your body in your chair, looking around and reminding yourself of where you are. And we're now going to do the self-check. So I'm not going to ask people to share out loud, but you can do this in your head or out loud, whatever you prefer, wherever you are. So you're first going to share or rate your personal distress number. So this goes from a 1, which is completely calm, to a 10, which is the most distressed ever. And distress, it's a common term, right? We talked about it earlier. So stress can look very different for someone. For some, stress may look like sadness, may look like anger. It's however the individual wants to describe or define distress for themselves. The second number that I'm going to have you rate is personal control. So how in control do you feel of your feelings, thoughts, and behaviors right now? With a 1 being, I am completely in control, versus 10, totally out of control. All right, and that is SOS. So pretty simple. This is a skill, again, that a lot of kids may already know that we can just simply do really quick. It just takes a few minutes and we can really reinforce it and gather information about how this youth is feeling while also encouraging them to identify their own feelings and regulate. The next concept we're going to talk about is mindfulness. And this is another one that is taught in Sparks and is focused on every session. And I want to provide a definition because I think a lot of times the word mindfulness is kind of like a hot topic and people think it's like meditation or relaxation. And that's not exactly what it is. Mindfulness is simply bringing your awareness to the present moment. This is focusing on one thing at a time without judgment. So when can we use this? We can very much use mindfulness at any time of the day. Like I said, it's important to not just practice mindfulness when we're stressed, but to practice it in our day-to-day lives because it's hard and it's like a muscle that we really need to work and build. We can also use it when we're distressed or ruminating and really, really struggling to be present in the moment. So for example, if let's say you're having a meeting with a kid and you mentioned something like a max sentence and they just hook onto that and can't think about anything else from that. It could be a good opportunity for you to pause and engage in a mindfulness practice to really bring them back to the present moment. All right, so how exactly do we practice mindfulness? So to practice mindfulness, you will choose just one thing to focus on. So this can be your breath. This can be an activity. So in Sparks, we do blowing bubbles with the kids as the mindfulness activity. Or it could be an object, looking or touching a certain object that you have. And all you do to be mindful is to bring your attention to that object or activity of focus. And your attention likely will wander. Like I said, this practice is challenging. So simply notice when you start to think about other things like what you have going on after this, what you're making for dinner. Acknowledge that, but then bring your attention back to the activity at hand. And just by simply being able to bring yourself back is being mindful. And again, this is challenging, so start small. Start like 30 seconds and see how it goes. And again, it is okay to have urges to talk, to have thoughts like, oh, this is stupid. And that's okay. Try to notice these thoughts and feelings without judgment and acknowledge them and then let them go. All right, so we are going to engage in a mindfulness practice together. So if you are able, I'm going to invite everyone to stand up and we are going to stand on one leg for 1 minute. So I don't really know. Let's see. You're going to stand in one leg for 1 minute. And part of the reason I'm having us practice these skills is because it's really important that us as the adults in these children's lives know how to regulate ourselves. So we're going to just practice standing on a leg for 1 minute. That's it. And I really encourage you to try to stay focused on standing on a leg. So you may notice how your body feels. You may notice certain emotions or thoughts that come up. Acknowledge those thoughts and try to stay as focused as you can on balancing on the one leg. If you start thinking about, oh, I have so much to do after this, or oh, I can't believe that frustrating thing happened yesterday. Again, that's okay. However, if once you notice that, try to bring yourself back to focusing on balancing on your one leg. All right, and ready, and go ahead. All right, and that was about a minute. I know it can seem really long when you're just doing one thing. So please go ahead and share in the chat if you feel comfortable. How was that for you? Was that easy or difficult? Were you able to just focus on your leg or were you thinking about other things the entire time? Did you have any judgments? Did you notice any physical sensations or emotions that popped up for you? I see people saying it was hard to keep focus. It was difficult and they realized how difficult it is. Definitely. It felt good to stand up and stretch. So maybe just that movement and standing up actually kind of roused them into mindful action and made it a little easier to focus. Noticing some urges, right? So someone said they had the urge to grab their water bottle or their phone. And And that's okay, again, to have that urge, but simply notice and try as best as you can to not act on that urge. We have more people saying it felt great to stretch. Awesome, thank you. All right, we're gonna move on to the next skill. So this next skill is a grounding exercise called the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding exercise. Can be really, really helpful to feel more present and connected to our surroundings. And this can be really, really helpful to use, especially with dissociation when someone's mind is just completely elsewhere. But even just dealing with stress, trying to kind of calm someone down, bring someone to a more mindful state, this could be really, really helpful. And I really, really like this skill because it doesn't require any materials. It can be done anywhere and no one even has to know that you're doing it. So all of the skill involves is using our senses to identify different things in our environment. So really tuning into our environment and paying attention to these things and trying again to not focus on other things, but really bringing our attention to this activity. So the first component of this activity is identifying 5 things they can see. So if I were doing this, I would say I see my purple water bottle, I see my yellow Post-it notes, I see my colorful mouse pad. Let's see, how many was that? 3. I see my tape dispenser and I see my sticker. So really challenging yourself to really identify and look at different details and things that you may otherwise not have noticed. Next, you identify 4 things that you can touch. So again, you may have to be creative to this and really think. So let's see, I'm touching the blanket underneath my chair and notice how it feels soft. I know I'm touching my shirt and noticing how it feels. See my keyboard and my phone screen. Next, you're going to identify 3 things that you can hear. Again, this can be challenging. You might only initially hear one thing, but I encourage you and challenge you to really tune in to ambient sounds and try to notice what you can hear. So right now for me, I can hear the air, I can hear my own voice, and I think it was a door closing. I just heard something in the background. Next, we're going to do smell. So 2 things that you can smell. You may not smell 2 distinct things in the air. So again, be creative. So you might smell your clothes and see how it smells. Mine smells like laundry detergent. Let's see. For my second one, I have lotion right here. So I'm going to put it on and smell that as my second smell. And finally, one thing you can taste. So this could be difficult if you're not actually eating something, but just simply tuning into the flavor in your mouth, which I know can sound kind of gross, but what are you tasting in your mouth right now? So like I can taste my coffee from this morning, for example. And this is, again, that is it. It really just takes a few minutes, but really can kind of pull you out of this kind of rumination pattern or really having your mind elsewhere, just bring you back into the moment. It can be really, really helpful. All right, the rest of the skills we're going to be talking about are distress tolerance skills. So these are specific skills that are like 911 crisis survival skills. And these really help us to cope with in the moment, to tolerate and cope with really overwhelming emotions. It's important to note these skills are not going to solve the problem. They're not going to bring, if a kid reports on their SOS that they're a 10-10, these skills are not going to bring them to a 1-1 and make everything all better. However, what the goal of these skills is that hopefully it can at least bring down their intense emotions a tiny bit. And in that moment, hopefully they can avoid acting on any negative urges and choose another coping skill to engage in that's adaptive rather than engaging in a maladaptive coping skill. All right, so the first skill we're going to talk about is self-soothing with the 6 senses. This is also from Spark. So again, maybe a skill that the kids you work with are already very familiar with. And you'll notice it says 6 senses, so that 6th sense is movement. All right, so what is self-soothe? It is a form of self-care, and it is essentially using our senses to do things that feel really comforting and provide relief from stress for us. And this is definitely a skill that requires some practice. It can feel really difficult and even unnatural for us to even think about doing something that's self-soothing when we're upset. It just may not feel right. So again, practicing not only when we're upset, but when we're calm can make us get more used to just doing these actions and will make it so much easier for us to engage in when we are really upset. So I provided some examples of different things we can do using our senses. Really, the options are endless. These are just things I try to think of that would be kind of feasible in our roles here. I know it can be tough because you can't always have different objects with you, for example. Another thing to note is that things are not going to work for everyone, right? Maybe for you, engaging your sense of hearing isn't really effective for you. It's not soothing. Or maybe you need to engage multiple senses at the same time. That's okay. So really learning what works for you. So with our sight, some things we could do are people watch. Could observe nature, so noticing the trees outside, the birds. Notice and identify colors around you. So maybe I'll go through the rainbow in my head and say, okay, I'm gonna find something that's red. All right, I'm gonna find something orange, and so on. You can look at calming or happy images on your phone. Or if you have nothing on you, you can simply picture a calming place in your mind. All right, for listening. So obviously we can listen to relaxing music, but I know we don't always have a listening device with us. So some other things we can do are tuning into the ambient sounds in our environment, things like traffic outside, the voices of people down the hall, and counting how many different distinct noises we can hear. Another thing we can do either out loud or in our mind is repeating a positive self-affirmation to really engage our sense of hearing and to just repeat this positive mantra or self-affirmation. And for the sense of taste, again, this one's a little difficult because you kind of need materials for it. But when feasible, some things you can do to self-soothe with taste include eating your favorite food, slowly sucking on a mint or piece of candy, eating something really slowly and mindfully, or taking small mindful sips of juice or tea. All right, for touch, some things we can do include playing with a fidget toy or a sensory item. And that can really be anything from putty to a fidget spinner, really any kind of fidget. Touch or pet something soft. So like if you're at home, petting your dog or your cat, or some kind of object that's really soothing to you. You can hug yourself. A lot of people find it comforting, just that pressure on themselves, or even putting on a weighted blanket can be really soothing. And even just pay attention to the different feelings on your skin. Again, if you don't have other things like a pet or a fidget toy with you, just simply noticing how the fabrics on your body feel. All right, for smell, different things you can do is what I just did earlier with the last exercise. Put on your favorite lotion and really take a big sniff and notice how that smells, if that's a comforting smell for you. Identify different smells in your environment. Have a diffuser in your office of a smell you really enjoy, or even just wearing perfume or cologne whose smell you enjoy. Again, these may sound very small. They are, wearing a cologne or perfume you like is not going to solve all your problems. However, it can be just a tiny little thing that you can key into when you're upset that can help calm you down, even just if it's the tiniest bit. And finally, for movement, we can do a number of things. We can, of course, walk, we can stretch, but if we're not able to get up in the moment, we can very gently rock ourselves. A lot of people find that very comforting. You can tap each of your fingers to your thumbs, going back and forth across your hands like this, or even crossing your arms across yourself and either patting or rubbing your upper arms can be very soothing. All right. And this is our final skill, tip skills. So tip skills are crisis survival skills again, but they are really focused on tipping or changing the body chemistry to reduce extreme emotions and physiological arousal. And this works super, super fast, which is why it can be really effective sometimes within seconds to minutes to really reduce our physiological arousal by activating our parasympathetic nervous system. And typically, if you do a tip skill, this reduction in arousal, it's not going to last forever. Again, it will only last maybe 5 to 20 minutes. But the hope is that during that time, you can avoid acting on an urge or engaging in a maladaptive coping strategy, and instead think of another strategy, or maybe get out of the situation if possible. Do whatever you can to not make the situation worse. All right, so in TIP, the first letter T stands for temperature. And this is really all about reducing your body temperature to quickly calm your physiological arousal. And this is actually done through a natural response or reflex called the dive response. And it's when you submerge your body, especially your face, in cold water, it automatically slows your heart rate and your breathing and helps your body really shift out of that fight or flight mode really quickly. So some things we can do in order to reduce our temperature is go to the bathroom and submerge or splash our face with cold water. However, that may not always be possible. So if you have an ice pack or even like a cold drink, holding that to your face and putting it on your cheeks, or my hands are really cold right now. Even just this feels nice and soothing. Drinking a glass of cold water or chewing on ice can be really effective for some people and kind of triggering that or reducing that physiological arousal. And we're in Chicago, it's cold like 9 months out of the year. So maybe stepping outside if that's feasible, to just get in a different environment and feel that cold to, really calm down your system. The next letter, I, in TIP, is intense exercise. So the goal of this is to expend the body's energy to really re-regulate. Our bodies have a lot of stored up physical energy, and this really helps us get that all out so that we're able to reduce our emotional intensity and regain control over our behavior. So for intense exercise, intense is definitely the key word. Just slowly walking around is likely not going to cut it. We really want to do something that gets our heart racing or, heart up, and that gets us really active. So things like running, jumping jacks, push-ups, we can run in place, running up down the stairs, anything that is an intense aerobic exercise that will really get our heart working. The first P in TIP skills now is paced breathing. So this is likely one that most people have heard of. I think I mentioned earlier, this is something I was doing right before this session, and something I very often do. And paced breathing is simply slowing down the speed at which we're breathing. Of course, we're breathing always, but it's not something that we're typically conscious of. With this skill, it is really bringing our consciousness and our thought to our breath and purposely slowing it down. There is no specific formula for the number of seconds or if you should hold your breath in between, anything like that. It really depends on the person. What science does tell us that if we can exhale longer than we can inhale, that makes it extra helpful in really activating that parasympathetic nervous system and really increasing our oxygen intake and reducing our heart rate. But we don't want to feel, lightheaded or out of breath. So, you don't want to push yourself to be inhaling for 10 seconds if that doesn't work for you. You need to do whatever works for you. It's also important to, as best you can, breathe deeply from your abdomen, not from your chest. So something I will do is place a hand on my chest and on my stomach so that I can notice where I'm breathing from. And if I notice my breaths are kind of coming, these shallow breaths from my chest, I can adjust accordingly. So I have just an example here is inhaling through your nose for 4 seconds and exhaling through your mouth or nose for 6 to 8. But of course, that can be adjusted for the individual. I also included this hand visual. I know sometimes visuals can be really helpful. Sometimes it can be hard to just do a coping skill without having any kind of like guidance. So I really like the hand one because we always have our hands on us. And all this is that you trace your hand, and as you're going up a finger, you breathe in, and as you're going down a finger, you breathe out. And you go through all your hands. So maybe if you're with a kid, you're like, okay, let's do 2 hands worth of breathing. And that just gives you a little kind of guidance and visual for the exercise. And this final component of TIP is progressive muscle relaxation. So this is the tensing and relaxing of each of our muscle groups that really helps to slow down our body and re-regulate ourselves. So there are 2 ways you can do this. I think somewhat more commonly is doing one muscle group at a time. So you may start in your toes And clench your toes for as hard as you can for just a few seconds, and then release. Release all the pressure. Then you'll move your way up to your calves. Tense your calf muscles as hard as you can, and then release, and so on. Or conversely, you can actually tense all the muscles you can in your body as best as you can for a few seconds, and then let go. And the goal here is to really pay attention to the feeling of that difference between what it feels like to be tense and what it feels like to be relaxed. All right, and that is it. In conclusion, just to kind of go through some of the key points here. Individuals that experience complex trauma often display significant dysregulation in multiple areas. And even though this dysregulation can be seen as like problem behaviors and can be very, very frustrating, it's important for us to remember that it's not necessarily defiance, that these behaviors developed out of necessity, not of survival. Also, humans are resilient and have the ability to learn, grow, and change. So this is really where our role could come in, that we have the opportunity to help youth and families in building their skills and building their resilience. And through that, we could do that through co-regulation, specifically through building positive relationships and the coaching and modeling skills. And this just really highlights, again, just this opportunity for really small day-to-day interactions that can create small but really meaningful changes, especially because we know that adolescence is really a key time where a significant development of self-regulation is possible, but it won't happen without those positive adult role models. So that's really a great opportunity for us. All right, and that is it. Here are my references. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michele. We're going to go ahead and pause the recording now, or stop it.